Greetings and welcome to another impressions video here at Words About Games, and today we're going to be looking at Star Renegades. Star Renegades is a roguelite strategy RPG which takes some heavy inspirations from classic JRPGs. You take control of the Renegades, a ragtag group of desperate heroes attempting to save the universe from the Empire, a group of soldiers seemingly hell-bent on the annihilation of all life. If your party should fall in battle and fail to stop the Empire, repurposed service bot J5T1N will hop to the next universe in the Empire's path in an attempt to help the Renegades finally stop them once and for all. Or die trying. Probably the latter. What impresses me most about Star Renegades, and there are a few things that have impressed me as I've been feeding my addiction to it, is the combat system. You lead a ragtag group of fighters on a mission that's almost certain to end in the doom of all life. Each character has a different class with wildly different abilities, strengths, and weaknesses, and how you can approach the entire game will depend on what characters you have in your squad. You start with 3 in your squad initially, and after each successful planet you liberate, you're able to add one of 2 new characters to your party. There's a bit of a learning curve to Star Renegade's combat. In each battle, all of the characters' moves take place on a timeline, which is visible at the top of the screen. You select all of your characters' attacks, and then, once you've input everything, the turn plays out. Quicker attacks happen first, with slower, more powerful attacks happening later. If one of your characters hits an enemy before they attack, you score a crit, which does extra damage and could trigger extra effects such as destroying armor, inflicting health damage through shields, or apply status effects such as bleeding. Attacks can also stagger enemies and push their moves further back on the timeline, and if your attack pushes an enemy's attack all the way off the timeline, you score a break, meaning the enemy attack won't happen at all in the current turn. Enemies can only be staggered a certain amount of times before they become immovable in the timeline, and their attacks will go off no matter what. I got my butt handed to me in my first couple of runs because I tried to play Star Renegades like a more typical strategy RPG, attempting to kill enemies as fast as possible and keep my characters alive through healing. It's a sound strategy in theory, but it doesn't quite work in practice because the main goal of fighting in Star Renegades isn't necessarily to hurt enemies and heal your own damage. I mean, sure, you win fights by killing bad guys, naturally, but to be actually successful at the game and not just feel like you're constantly hanging on by the skin of your teeth, you need to learn how to master the timeline. Rather than focusing on damage and healing, the best strategy is to isolate enemies and knock them off the timeline completely. While your health is a valuable commodity that's difficult to regain, your characters have shields that fully recharge after each fight. So combat becomes about managing who's taking what damage and how to avoid the bigger hits. I don't want to go too in depth about Star Renegade's combat system. I could write an entire essay on all of its intricacies and the synergies between different characters, but once I ditched the healer character from my starting party for Bentley, a robot who specialised in counter-attacking and attacks with a higher stagger rate, I started to make much deeper forays into the game. Fights are almost like puzzles to be solved. Healing is cool, but manipulating the timeline can mitigate a heck of a lot more damage in the long run. Plus it makes the game a heck of a lot more fun to play than turtling up and trying to heal through exponentially more powerful bad guys. My only complaint comes from the game's formation system. From the second planet onwards, enemies will utilise formations that mean that most of your characters will only be able to hit someone on the front row. It's a cool system that adds an extra layer of strategic depth to encounters, but if you perform a kill shot on that enemy, you can't set up your other characters to take advantage later in the timeline, because they still won't be able to reach the other enemies. It's not a massive issue, but it can lead to some wasted turns in a game where every move is vitally important. Between fights, you'll be exploring various procedurally generated overworld maps. On each planet, you have 3 days to explore before the final boss fight, and you can make 3 moves per day. Different tiles will house enemy encounters, boss encounters, loot of varying degrees of rarity, credits, DNA, which is the game's XP system, and more. Certain areas will become locked off during a day, so you'll need to plan the optimal path to grab XP and loot as efficiently as possible. Each world is procedurally generated, meaning that no 2 runs will ever be exactly the same. Each planet also comes with a set of bosses with their own strengths and weaknesses, usually guarding rare loot. These are incredibly tough fights, and should one of these bosses take you down, they'll level up in Star Renegades' adversary system, which is very similar to the Nemesis system from the Middle-earth games. Every night you'll make camp, and your party will be able to use cards to provide buffs for the next day or heal damage. Each character has their own set of cards that they can play on their companions, and using them will fill a relationship meter. The higher the meter, the stronger their bond, which unlocks neat interactions between them as well as buffs and, eventually, tag team attacks they can perform in battles for massive damage. As with any roguelite, Star Renegades has two types of progression: in-run leveling and permanent upgrades. During runs you can spend DNA to level your party members, unlocking new abilities and cards for them, as well as buffing their damage and health. Loot you find or buy from merchants with credits can come in the form of weapons, armor, and gear, all of which grant huge passive buffs. Between runs you're able to spend other currency gathered in your travels to unlock permanent character upgrades or unlock new starting characters. It's all fairly standard roguelite stuff, and it's handled well here. You get a nice sense of progression during runs, and the stuff you unlock between runs genuinely makes you feel like you're taking an extra advantage into your next attempt. Star Renegades is a game I cannot get enough of right now. I sit down with it intending to play for an hour and end up playing for 3, whether I'm winning or losing. If I'm doing well, I want to keep the train going, and if I'm not doing so well, I throw myself straight back into another run, empowered by any new upgrades I've acquired in the interim. It's the combat system that's keeping me hooked though. Once I went around a couple of times and really got to grips with how it works, it hooked me in with its many layers of deep strategy and timeline manipulation. If anything I've said to describe this game intrigues you, then pick it up, because this is one of the most addictive games I've played in months. Thanks very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, consider sticking around here at Words About Games. Our content includes review impressions of games big and small, a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing the happenings in and around the games industry, weekly opinion videos, reactions, debate-driven top 5 and top 10 lists, a regular Hall of Fame series where we discuss our favourite games, and indie game spotlights. We also stream every Friday and Saturday at twitch.tv/wordsaboutgames. Most importantly, have a brilliant day.